So one misconception that I'm seeing a lot of people make about the COVID-19 pandemic is essentially framing it in the libertarian narrative that it is entirely the state or the government that is behind the lockdown. Now, I mean, if you look at it, yes, most of these policies are imposed by the government. However, if you see who is influencing these policies on a high level and who is benefiting from them, major elite players like Amazon and Bill Gates come up. To me, it's pretty obvious that there's a lot of corporate collusion going on here at a high level. And you see that, for instance, here in Ontario as well, where a lot of the lockdown regulations punish small business and favor big business. Like, they allow big box stores to have looser regulations than small businesses. So this idea that it's just the government doing this and that corporations are not complicit, I think is largely untrue. Additionally, some people, like, I've seen a lot of people say that they believe the lockdown would just end if the government ended it. But that's not entirely true, because there have been a number of cases of private corporations essentially enforcing lockdown policies beyond what the government requires. I've seen this firsthand in a number of cases. For instance, back in summer 2020, when the lockdown regulations were temporarily less strict here, and indoor dining was allowed, but at a distance, like with some tables closed, certain fast food restaurants like Popeyes, from what I saw, were still closed entirely to indoor dining, even when the government would have allowed some amount of indoor dining to exist. The same is also true for a lot of churches, like Catholic churches in particular, were closed to tourists entirely, even when the regulations were at a point where tourism would have been allowed, at least on some level. Maybe not full capacity, but there would have been some tourists allowed according to the law. Other privately owned tourist attractions like Casa Loma, for instance. Now, Casa Loma is a castle that was built in the early 20th century in Toronto. It's like a palatial estate. It's a major tourist attraction in Toronto. I believe it was still closed the entire time, even when the regulations were relaxed a little bit and would have allowed it to be open with some diminished capacity. So there's those examples. Also, I know a number of airlines are talking about requiring passengers to be vaccinated, even though the government, I don't think any governments are requiring this by law. This is something that airlines are talking about doing voluntarily. I'm not sure if any have started implementing this policy just yet, but I know they're definitely talking about it. So they're really getting ahead of the curve and ahead of government requirements on that one. So there's those instances. And also, there's been a number of stores I've seen that are just closed entirely, not even allowing people to come inside for pickup. So again, like, I mean, this idea that it's entirely the government and that private businesses aren't voluntarily locking down, it's not entirely true. Like, I mean, I agree that the government rules are repressive and that most of these rules should be gotten rid of. Like, I would not maintain any of these lockdown regulations with the exception of, like, I guess mask laws indoors, other than like restaurant seating, because you can't really eat with a mask on. But I mean, basically kind of like how it was in summer 2020, but maybe a bit less strict in some regards, like especially with like border policies and like trying to discourage tourism. Like, I would not do that. But at the same time, it's like, okay, even if I would get rid of the vast majority of lockdown regulations, at the same time, I think it's naive to expect that things would just go back to normal. Because as I've said, a lot of private businesses, especially big businesses, but to some extent small ones, but mostly big ones, have been voluntarily implementing lockdown type policies beyond what the government requires. And I could see that continuing even if all or nearly all of the government of the lockdown laws were lifted. And I think it's a bit naive to think this is entirely government repression or state repression, which kind of goes in line with the libertarian narrative, but it's not. Like, there's a lot of collusion on high levels. It's obvious that some of the major corporations are benefiting financially from this, like Amazon, for instance, and there's a very good chance that some of these corporations on some level are colluding with the government. They are complicit in the lockdown itself because it's benefiting them. And I think to some extent there's also corporations that just buy into the hysteria, that believe that this virus is super deadly and that they want to protect employees or customers or whatever. Like, I think on some level there is actually, at least that's more with smaller businesses. Like, I would say with big businesses, the motive always tends to be profit. But with small businesses, there could be some element of genuine concern about the virus itself. But my point is, it is a bit naive to think that everything is just going to go back to normal if the lockdown was lifted. And I do believe that the majority of lockdown rules, laws should be lifted. But I'm just saying, if you really wanted things to go back to normal, you would have to also basically ban private corporations from enforcing their own lockdown regulations or mask regulations or whatever. You would have to actually ban them from doing that too, on top of removing the government lockdown policies. Now, should we ban corporations from doing that? I don't know. I mean, maybe. I haven't really thought it through enough, but I'm just saying, yeah, you'd have to think about that too. I mean, in particular, I think it's a bit ridiculous how strict the Catholic Church has been, and that was way beyond what the government required, especially in the summer. Like, they were not allowing tourists into their churches at all, and that was way beyond what the government was requiring. Me and my dad actually snuck into a church during Mass, even though we're not Catholic. We just went in to kind of look at the cathedral. And again, like, why should we have to do that? Like, I'm willing to pay the admission fee or donate. I did donate a little bit of money to the church, and it's like, okay, like, I mean, why shouldn't we be allowed to go inside these buildings? Like, it's a bit ridiculous. And it's not just the government, frankly. It's private companies too. Like, as I said, the airlines, like, I don't know, the Catholic Church, whatever you'd call it, whatever kind of entity you'd call it, it's not the government. So it's like airlines, churches, fast food restaurants, who knows who else. So my point is, it's not just the government, it's not just the state.